Welcome to lesson 11. This is the second part of the three-part lesson about investing. So we've all heard the expression, do not put all your eggs in one basket. I cannot stress enough that this maxim is exceptionally true when it comes to personal finance. The word frequently used is diversification. So how do we diversify? Asset allocation is an investment strategy that aims to balance risk and reward by apportioning a portfolio's assets according to an individual's goals, risk tolerance, and investment horizon. Yeah, okay, so I stole that from a textbook. Let me give you, let me explain in more simple terms. Asset allocation is a strategy where you allocate your investment portfolio into different classes or categories of investments that each have their own risk and reward profile in order to avoid having all your eggs in one basket. Replace the word allocate with diversify if that helps you understand. Essentially, that's what you're doing. You are diversifying. Another way to think of this is that you're spreading your money across multiple investments and asset classes. Asset allocation is one of the most commonly used strategies because it inherently diversifies and is accepted as a prudent way to invest money. For those of you that want an applied example of this, let's pretend you had $250,000 to invest, $250,000. Well, there's multiple things you could invest in, right? One thing you could do is you could go buy a piece of property worth $250,000 and make that your rental property or some sort of investment property. But that wouldn't really be diversifying because you only have one item that you have all your money tied up in. Let's say you wish to spread your risk by purchasing two properties. One property worth $100,000 and then the other one across the street that's worth $150,000. Now you've begun to diversify because now you don't have all your eggs in one basket. But let's say you consider this and then you decide, instead of that, let's invest one property with $100,000 and let's take the next $150,000 and invest in shares of Apple, Computer, and IBM. This is more diversification because now you have two different asset classes. You have real estate and you have two U.S. large technology stocks. So you get more diversification by doing that. But then you realize you're not diversified enough since Apple, Computer, IBM, and that house that you purchased may all go down in value at the same time. So you consider buying that property for $100,000, but then invest only $100,000 in two companies, the IBM and Apple example, and then purchase shares of Nestle because they're based in Europe. It's a European stock. You still have $50,000 left over and decide to buy some U.S. government bonds since you feel those are the safest. Now you've really begun to allocate your assets across multiple categories, known as asset classes. By doing this, you spread your risk out because the chances that Nestle, Apple, IBM Computer, the $100,000 property, and the U.S. government bonds will all decline in tandem are less than the chances that one single property worth $250,000 would go down in value at one time. I one time engaged in a debate that purchasing two $1 lottery tickets instead of just buying one $2 ticket is diversifying. I hate to admit it, but on some level that is diversifying. Unfortunately, it's diversifying into two items that have a high likelihood of capital loss of that $2. So, what's an asset class? How do we define that, and what are some examples? An asset class is simply a category of a type of investment. You can be as general as U.S. stock, or you can get more specific like largely capitalized, growth-oriented U.S. companies. Or you can get even more specific like largely capitalized, growth-oriented U.S. technology companies. Or, even more specific than that, largely capitalized, growth-oriented U.S. software technology companies. Basically, an asset class is just some sort of category of how you can invest your money. I've listed some asset classes here, but this is pretty far from an exhaustive list. Here, we have a very academic look at the relationship between risk and return. Simply stated, the more risk associated with an investment, the more potential return it may have. This isn't to say just by taking a lot of risk, you'll have a lot more return. Asset classes themselves have an expected position on this line. When you blend asset classes together, your entire portfolio has its own position on this line based upon the weighted average of all the asset classes inside your portfolio. This means that the asset class of U.S. stocks would probably have a position on the line that indicates more risk and more return than government bonds. Government bonds would be closer to the arrow of where it says low risk and low return, whereas U.S. stocks would probably be closer to the arrow where it says high risk, high return, or maybe somewhere between the medium risk and medium return arrow. But if you create an asset allocation that has 50% of each, U.S. stocks as well as government bonds, that portfolio's measured dot would be somewhere between the dots for each individual asset class, somewhere probably between the middle of the two. Many people consider themselves aggressive or risky investors since they know there's a tremendous upside. Many of these aforementioned people change their mind once they experience a loss, though. In order to know your true risk tolerance, you should consider the potential and historical upside as well as the downside of any investment or asset class. So what goes into getting the right distribution of your assets? How do you properly allocate your assets? Well, we have to look at your ability to assume risk. This is called your risk tolerance. We look at your time frame or investment horizon, your goals, your investment experience, and even potentially your tax situation. For instance, if you have a lot of time on your side and a high propensity for risk, you should probably have an appropriate allocation that invests in more higher risk related investments. Conversely, someone with less time and a lower risk tolerance would have more conservative or safe investments in their asset allocation. But an investor with less time and equally high risk tolerance in the first example may actually have a completely different asset allocation recommendation than the first or second investor mentioned because they have different, just because they have the same risk tolerance doesn't mean they have the same time, and then the asset allocation may be different itself. So what are some drawbacks of diversifying or using asset allocation? Well, the first obvious one is what I call the lucky investment. Sometimes people weight their portfolios heavily towards one stock or just a few investments because they want to take a lot of risk. For instance, if you purchased Apple Computer stock when it was $70 and then sold it at $600, you would probably feel pretty confident that you knew what you were doing. Plus, you might laugh at your friends who are diversified because that diversification would act as a drag compared to the one investment at Apple that's shooting through the roof. History has shown us, however, time and time again, that it is very difficult and rare to pick that one stock or investment that does this. There's no denying that occasionally people do pick right. These same people may go on and on about their selection, but I find it's very analogous to that friend who won a bunch of money in Vegas playing blackjack. It should be accepted that luck and chance are a big part of their winning. Additionally, they may have lost a ton of money at a previous game and not disclose part of that. So one of the drawbacks again of asset allocation is you are diversified. If there's one investment that has a straight line, a straight positive line, that's the other things that you're diversifying into will drag that down. However, again, the idea is to spread your risk across multiple different investments. Another drawback is the investor's risk tolerance is not always known ahead of time. I discussed this on the previous slide that many investors consider themselves to be aggressive when they just want the upside but aren't comfortable necessarily with the potential loss. Security selection within an asset class will not necessarily produce a risk profile to that asset class. What does that mean? Let's consider the example on the other slide where I mentioned buying a house or a single $250,000 investment property. It's highly possible that while real estate in general is growing at, let's say, 5 or 6%, the property or investment that you own may decline in value due to outside factors such as the surrounding properties shrinking in value or the house just being destroyed, being in a fire zone, anything that's just different than the whole real estate asset class in general. In considering stocks, if you purchase shares of Ford Motor, it may not perform as well as its peers in the automobile category, or even the category of stocks of U.S. large companies. Lastly, the phrase past performance is never a guarantee or indicator of future results is frequently used in the financial industry. This means that just because it rained yesterday doesn't mean it will rain tomorrow or the next week. It does not necessarily guarantee it will rain 364 days from today. Although some people like to use this as a basis, it doesn't really guarantee anything. This is equally true with predicting the weather based upon recent weather or predicting stock performance. So you hear the phrase buy low, sell high a lot because in theory it's a great idea. But it hasn't always performed completely well in life. One way to systematically do it is to rebalance your portfolio periodically. If you wish to systematically buy low and sell high, one way would be to rebalance 4 times a year. Rebalancing means you always review your portfolio when the weighting of your different asset classes change. Let's pretend that you decide to invest in an asset allocation that is 60% stocks, U.S. stocks, 20% in investment real estate, and 20% in bonds. Let's now fast forward to 18 months, and your portfolio shifts from the aforementioned 60-20-20 to 75% in U.S. stocks, 10% in real estate, and 50% in bonds because U.S. stocks had a great year of growth and real estate declined in value. If you were able to sell the gains from the U.S. stocks and reduce your exposure from 75% to 60%, and then spread those gains to buy more real estate and more bonds, you would essentially be rebalancing. As a result, your portfolio will go back to 60% U.S. stocks, 20% in real estate, and 20% in bonds. Voila! You should have sold high and bought low just by rebalancing in this example. Now there's 2 things to note. You aren't necessarily selling at the highest point, nor are you necessarily buying at the lowest point, because timing a market has been proven very difficult to do. Choosing a specific date to rebalance systematically would remove some of the emotion and some of the guessing as to when the best time to rebalance is. The second thing to note is all asset classes may have declined in value, but if the weighting has changed, you should rebalance. You should still be buying the worst performing asset class at a lower point. By choosing an asset allocation, dictating what can and cannot go into your portfolio, and then deciding things like frequency, specific dates to rebalance, you've created a personal investment policy statement. You can also add things like reasons to rebalance, such as if one asset class doubles in weighting, rebalances back to the, if one asset class doubles in weighting, that might be a reason why you'd want to rebalance back to the original desired asset allocation. Now there's multiple studies that talk about asset allocation. I won't go into detail about them, but if you can do an internet search for some of the names listed here, you might get some insight as to the academic foundation of asset allocation. One note I'll leave you with. It's important to note that asset allocation and diversifying do not guarantee against a loss. I'll repeat, they do not guarantee against an investment loss. Instead, the idea here is that you're reducing your risk because you are not putting all of your eggs in one basket.